Dramily.com, unlimited drama series.
The first thing you need to know about my wife, Erica, is that she's the kind of woman who can make a man feel like a king one day and a peasant the next. The second thing is that she's been screwing my business partner, Simon Vance, in our greenhouse for the past 6 months, and she thinks I'm too stupid to notice. My name is David Locke, and I'm supposedly just another environmental engineer scraping by in Charleston's fading grandeur. At least, that's what everyone believes. The truth is considerably more complicated, but we'll get to that. I discovered Erica's affair the way most cuckolded husbands do, through a combination of suspicious behavior and sheer dumb luck. She'd started working late, going to the gym more often, and buying lingerie that never seemed to make an appearance in our bedroom. The final piece fell into place when I found a burner phone hidden in her jewelry box, filled with coded messages about Project Eden and midnight greenhouse meetings. The irony wasn't lost on me. Our greenhouse, the one I'd built with my own hands as a wedding gift, had become their secret love nest. I stood in the shadow of the old magnolia tree, watching my wife of 8 years wrap her legs around Simon Vance like he was the last life preserver on the Titanic. The greenhouse glowed with soft amber light, and through the glass panels, their silhouettes moved in a dance I knew intimately, but hadn't been invited to perform in months. Jesus, Simon, we can't keep doing this, Erica gasped, her voice carrying through the humid Charleston night. If David finds out, David's an idiot, Simon interrupted, his hands roaming over her body with practiced familiarity. He spends his days measuring soil samples and his nights reading environmental journals. The man wouldn't notice if we did this on his desk. I felt something cold settle in my chest, not heartbreak. That had happened months ago when I first suspected. This was something else, something calculating. Still, Erica murmured, he's not completely helpless. He owns this place, after all. Simon laughed, a sound like gravel in a garbage disposal. This crumbling money pit? Honey, your husband is house rich and cash poor. Once you divorce him, you'll get half of everything, and I'll help you sell it to developers. We'll make millions turning this place into condos. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Not because I needed evidence, I'd been collecting that for weeks, but because I wanted to remember this moment. The moment I decided to destroy them both. The next morning, Erica sat across from me at breakfast, buttering her toast with the same hands that had been all over Simon 12 hours earlier. She looked radiant, which made sense. Good sex will do that to a woman, even if it's not with her husband. I'm thinking of throwing a charity gala here next month, I said casually, not looking up from my coffee. Something for the city's environmental initiatives. Erica's hand paused halfway to her mouth. Here? David, this place isn't exactly in entertaining condition. It's got character, I replied. Besides, people love the whole faded southern grandeur thing. Very atmospheric. Who would you invite? Oh, the usual crowd. City council members, local business owners, environmental groups. I took a sip of coffee. Simon, obviously, since he's been so supportive of green initiatives lately. The piece of toast slipped from her fingers. Simon, I didn't know you two were that close. We're not, I said, finally meeting her eyes. But we're about to be. The Locke mansion had been in my family for 4 generations, though most people assumed we'd lost our money decades ago. The paint was peeling, the gardens were overgrown, and half the shutters hung at odd angles. It was all carefully maintained decay. My grandfather's idea of hiding in plain sight. Mr. David, called Ms. Jean, our housekeeper, as I walked through the main hall. She'd been with the family since before I was born, and she was one of the few people who knew the truth about our finances. Your friend Mr. Felix is here to see you. Felix Morrison had been my roommate at Duke and was now one of Charleston's most respected attorneys, though he specialized in environmental law rather than the more lucrative corporate stuff. He was also the only person outside of family who knew about my inheritance. Dave, he said, rising from the leather chair in my study, you look like hell. Thanks for the pep talk. I poured myself 2 fingers of bourbon. The good stuff, not the rot gut I kept in the kitchen for show. I need your professional opinion on something. Shoot. Hypothetically speaking, if someone were planning to humiliate their cheating spouse and her lover in the most legally sound way possible, what would you recommend? Felix raised an eyebrow. Hypothetically speaking, I'd recommend couples therapy. Try again. He sighed and accepted the bourbon I offered. Okay, hypothetically, I'd say the key is making them destroy themselves. Give them enough rope, create the right circumstances, and let their own greed and stupidity do the heavy lifting. That's what I was thinking. Dave, please tell me you're not planning anything that'll get you arrested. Nothing illegal, I assured him. Just creative. The invitations went out the following week. I'd kept the guest list small but influential. About 50 people who mattered in Charleston's environmental and social circles. The theme was Green Futures, and I'd positioned it as a fundraiser for urban sustainability projects. Simon called me personally to accept, which was a nice touch. Dave, buddy, this is fantastic, he said, his voice dripping with fake enthusiasm. Really shows your commitment to the cause. I try to do my part, I replied. I'm especially looking forward to the auction. We've got some really unique items donated. Auction? Didn't I mention that? We're auctioning off experiences and services. Weekend getaways, consulting packages, that sort of thing. I was hoping you might donate something from your company. There was a pause. Simon's company was basically him in a rented office, brokering deals between actual environmental firms and local government contracts. He made decent money, but he wasn't exactly swimming in disposable income. Of course, he said finally. I'd be happy to contribute. Excellent. How about a comprehensive sustainability consultation worth, say, $5,000? Another pause. That's generous. It's for a good cause, I said. I'm sure you understand. The night of the gala, the mansion looked better than it had in years. I'd hired a crew to clean the windows, trim the hedges, and string lights throughout the gardens. The effect was magical, like stepping back in time to when the Locke family actually entertained regularly. Erica had bought a new dress for the occasion, a stunning emerald number that probably cost more than most people's rent. She looked incredible, and I made sure to tell her so. You're in a good mood, she observed as we greeted guests in the foyer. Why wouldn't I be? Beautiful wife, beautiful house, beautiful cause. She smiled, but there was something uncertain in her eyes. Erica had always been able to read me better than most people, and I think she sensed that something was different tonight. Simon arrived fashionably late, wearing a tuxedo that fit just a little too well. He'd clearly spent money he didn't have to look the part, which was exactly what I'd been counting on. Dave, he boomed, slapping me on the back like we were old friends. Hell of a turnout. Charleston loves a good party, I replied, especially when it's for charity. The evening proceeded smoothly through cocktails and dinner. I gave a brief speech about environmental responsibility, thanked everyone for coming, and then announced the auction. Our first item, I said standing at the makeshift podium we'd set up in the main hall, is a weekend at the Kiowa Island Resort, donated by the Morrison Family Trust. Do I hear 500? The bidding was spirited but civilized. The weekend package went for $1,200 to a city councilwoman who'd been eyeing it from the start. We worked through several more items, a wine tasting experience, a set of custom garden furniture, a week-long photography workshop. Then came the main event. Next up, I announced, we have a comprehensive sustainability consultation from Vance Environmental Solutions, valued at $5,000. Simon's face went pale. He'd donated the consultation expecting it to go for maybe 1,000, 1,500 tops. 5,000 was more than he could afford to lose. Do I hear 500 to start? A hand went up immediately, then another. Within minutes, the bidding had reached $3,000. And Simon was starting to sweat. 3,500, called out Margaret Chen, who owned half the restaurants in the historic district. 4,000, countered James Bishop, a local real estate developer. All eyes turned to Simon. As the donor, he had the option to bid on his own item. Not uncommon at charity auctions and perfectly legal. But if he won, he'd be paying for the privilege of doing work he'd already committed to donate. 4,500, Simon said, his voice tight. 5,000, Bishop shot back immediately. Simon's jaw worked silently. 5,000 was exactly what he'd claimed the consultation was worth. If he bid higher, he'd be admitting he'd undervalued his own services. If he didn't bid, he'd lose face in front of Charleston's business community. 5,500, he said finally. 6,000, Bishop replied without hesitation. I watched Simon's face cycle through a range of emotions, panic, anger, desperation. He looked at Erica, who was staring at him with obvious concern. Then he looked at me, and for just a moment, I saw understanding flicker in his eyes. 6,500, he said. 7,000, Bishop countered. Simon's hands were shaking now. $7,000 was probably more than he had in his checking account. But backing down now would be professional suicide in a town where reputation was everything. 7,500, he whispered. The room fell silent. Bishop shrugged and shook his head. Too rich for my blood. Sold, I announced, to Simon Vance for $7,500. The applause was polite but uncomfortable. Everyone could see that Simon had just paid $7,500 for the privilege of doing $5,000 worth of work for free. After the auction, I found Simon on the back terrace, loosening his bow tie and staring out at the garden. He looked like a man who'd just realized he'd been played but couldn't quite figure out how. Hell of a party, Dave, he said without turning around. Glad you enjoyed it. That was quite a show in there. Charity auctions can get competitive. He turned to face me then, and his expression was pure venom. You son of a bitch. You set me up. I have no idea what you're talking about. Like hell you don't. You knew exactly what you were doing with that auction. I shrugged. I just provided the venue. You're the one who chose to bid. Simon stepped closer, his hands clenched into fists. You think you're so fucking smart, don't you? Sitting in your crumbling mansion, playing your little games. Careful, Simon. We're still at a charity event. Fuck the charity event, he snarled. And fuck you. You want to know the truth, Dave? Your wife is screwing me. Has been for months. And you know what the really funny part is? She's only staying married to you until she can figure out how to get half of this worthless pile of bricks. I nodded slowly. Is that so? Yeah, that's so. So take your smug little victory and shove it up your ass, because in 6 months, you're going to be living in a studio apartment while I'm balls deep in your ex-wife. Interesting theory, I said. There's just one problem with it. What's that? I smiled. You're assuming this house is all I have. Something in my tone must have warned him, because Simon's expression shifted from anger to uncertainty. What do you mean? I mean, you might want to do a little more research before you start making plans for other people's assets. Before he could respond, I heard a splash from the direction of the koi pond, followed by a string of curses. We both turned to see James Bishop pulling himself out of the water, his tuxedo dripping and his dignity in tatters. What the hell happened? Simon asked. Looks like he slipped, I said innocently. These old flagstones can be treacherous when they're wet. But Simon wasn't paying attention to Bishop anymore. He was staring at me with the dawning realization that he'd severely underestimated his opponent. Who are you? He asked quietly. I'm exactly who I've always been, I replied. You just never bothered to look very hard. The next morning, I found Erica packing a suitcase in our bedroom. She moved with quick, efficient motions, the way she did everything when she was nervous. Going somewhere? I asked from the doorway. She didn't look up. I'm staying at Tara's for a few days. I think we need some space. Because of last night? Because of everything. She finally met my eyes. I know about the cameras, David. I felt a chill run down my spine. What cameras? The ones in the greenhouse. Did you really think I wouldn't notice? I had to admire her composure. Even caught red-handed, Erica was trying to maintain the upper hand. I don't know what you're talking about. Please. She zipped the suitcase shut. Simon found them yesterday afternoon while he was setting up for the party. We know you've been watching us. And what exactly did you think I was watching? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Don't play dumb, David. It doesn't suit you. We both know what's been going on. Do we? I want a divorce. Okay. The simplicity of my response seemed to throw her off balance. She'd been prepared for anger, pleading, maybe even violence. She hadn't expected acceptance. Okay, she repeated, if that's what you want. I want half of everything. The house, the investments, all of it. That seems fair. Now she looked genuinely confused. What's wrong with you? Why aren't you fighting this? What would be the point? If you're unhappy, you should leave. If you think you're entitled to half of my assets, we can let the lawyers sort that out. Your assets, she said slowly. David, what aren't you telling me? I walked to the window and looked out at the gardens. Miss Jean was pruning the roses, the same way she had every morning for 30 years.
2,000! I didn't get any jewelry.
I was ending
With a
it.
diamond goodbye gift?
Watch more on Grammarly.com.
Some things never changed. I'm not telling you lots of things, Erica. That's what makes them secrets. She stared at me for a long moment, then grabbed her suitcase and headed for the door. My lawyer will be in touch. I'll have Felix give him a call. She paused at the threshold. You're different. No, I said. I'm exactly the same. You just never bothered to pay attention. Felix's office was in a restored antebellum mansion on Broad Street, all polished wood and leather-bound law books. He'd been expecting my call. So, she finally pulled the trigger, he said, pouring coffee from an antique silver service. Yesterday morning. Her lawyer should be contacting you soon. Richard Pemberton, Felix said. Already heard from him. Cocky bastard, but competent enough. What's his opening position? 50-50 split of all marital assets, plus alimony. Pretty standard stuff. Felix leaned back in his chair. Dave, are you sure you want to do this the hard way? We could probably settle for 30% and save everyone a lot of trouble. I'm sure. Okay, but you realize that once we start down this path, there's no going back. When the truth comes out, and it will come out, Erica's going to feel like you've been lying to her your entire marriage. Haven't I been? Felix considered this. I suppose that's one way to look at it. Your grandfather did make you promise to keep the trust secret until you turned 40. 2 more years? 2 more years, he agreed. But Dave, once this information becomes public record, everyone's going to know. You won't be able to go back to being the struggling environmental engineer. I thought about that. For 15 years, I'd lived a carefully constructed lie. I drove a 10-year-old Honda, shopped at discount stores, and let people assume the mansion was more burden than blessing. It had been my grandfather's idea, a way to ensure that anyone who loved me was loving the real me, not the Locke family fortune. The irony was that it had worked exactly as intended. Erica had never loved the real me. I'm ready, I said. Then let's give them hell. The first shot was fired 3 days later. Pemberton filed a motion for temporary support, claiming that Erica needed $5,000 a month to maintain her standard of living while the divorce proceeded. It was a standard tactic. Establish a high baseline for negotiations. Felix responded by filing our own motion for discovery, demanding complete financial records from both Erica and Simon. If they wanted to play hardball, we'd play hardball. You sure about including Simon? Felix asked as we reviewed the paperwork. Absolutely. If she's planning a future with him, his finances are relevant to her need for support. It's going to piss them off. Good. The hearings began 2 weeks later. Charleston County Family Court was a depressing place. Fluorescent lights, institutional carpeting, and the lingering smell of desperation. Judge Patricia Hawkins presided, a stern woman in her 60s who'd been handling divorce cases since before I was born. Erica looked stunning, as always. She'd chosen a conservative navy dress that suggested both respectability and vulnerability. Simon sat in the gallery behind her, trying to look supportive, but mostly succeeding in looking nervous. Pemberton made his opening argument with practiced smoothness. His client had been married for 8 years to a man who'd hidden his true financial situation. She'd contributed to the marriage as a homemaker and partner, and she deserved her fair share of the assets they'd built together. Then Felix stood up. Your Honor, he began, opposing counsel is correct that there has been deception in this marriage. However, he's wrong about who's been doing the deceiving. He opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. I'd like to submit into evidence photographs and video recordings showing Mrs. Locke engaged in an extramarital affair with Mr. Simon Vance, who is present in the courtroom today." The blood drained from Erica's face. Pemberton shot to his feet, objecting, but Judge Hawkins waved him down. "I'll allow it," she said. "This is a no-fault state, but adultery is still relevant to questions of support and asset division." Felix distributed copies of the evidence, carefully edited to be damning without being pornographic. There were photos of Erica and Simon entering hotels, video of them kissing in his car, and audio recordings of their conversations in the greenhouse. "Furthermore," Felix continued, "we have evidence that Mrs. Locke and Mr. Vance have been planning to defraud my client by concealing assets and manipulating property values." He played the recording from the greenhouse, Simon's voice filling the courtroom. "Once you divorce him, you'll get half of everything, and I'll help you sell it to developers. We'll make millions turning this place into condos." Erica was crying now, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of rage and humiliation. Simon looked like he wanted to crawl under his chair and disappear. But Felix wasn't done. "Your Honor, there's one more thing the court should know about my client's financial situation." He withdrew another document from his briefcase, this one bearing the seal of the South Carolina Secretary of State. "Mr. Locke is not the struggling environmental engineer he appears to be. He is, in fact, the sole beneficiary of the Locke Family Environmental Trust, established by his grandfather in 1987. The trust currently holds assets valued at approximately $47 million. The courtroom erupted. Pemberton was on his feet again. Erica was staring at me in shock, and Simon looked like he'd been hit by a truck. Judge Hawkins banged her gavel for order. "Mr. Morrison, are you telling me that your client is worth $47 million? "Yes, Your Honor. The trust has been funding environmental initiatives throughout the Southeast for the past 35 years. My client has been the anonymous benefactor behind numerous conservation projects, including the Charleston Harbor cleanup and the Ashley River restoration." I watched Erica's face as the implications sank in. All those years of her feeling superior, all those comments about my lack of ambition, all those times she'd made me feel small, and I'd been worth more money than she could have imagined. "Your Honor," Felix continued, "given this new information, we'd like to amend our response to the petition. We're seeking a finding that Mrs. Locke is entitled to no support whatsoever, and that all marital assets should remain with my client." "On what grounds?" Judge Hawkins asked. "Adultery, attempted fraud, and the fact that Mrs. Locke contributed nothing to the acquisition of these assets. The trust predates the marriage, and my client's inheritance was always separate property." Pemberton tried to recover, arguing that Erica had been deceived about the true nature of the marital estate, but the damage was done. Judge Hawkins recessed the hearing to review the evidence, but I could see in her eyes that she'd already made up her mind. The final hearing was scheduled for the following month, but the real drama played out in the court of public opinion. Word of the Locke family fortune spread through Charleston like wildfire, and suddenly, everyone wanted to be my friend. The irony was delicious. For years, I'd been dismissed as a harmless eccentric, the last scion of a fated family living in genteel poverty. Now, overnight, I was Charleston's most eligible bachelor, assuming I could get rid of my cheating wife. Erica, meanwhile, had become a pariah. The recordings Felix had played in court had been leaked to the local media, and her affair with Simon was front-page news in the Charleston Post and Courier. Her PR firm had quietly let her go, and most of her friends had stopped returning her calls. Simon had it even worse. The revelation that he'd been planning to defraud me had destroyed what little credibility he'd had in the environmental consulting business. His clients had abandoned him, his office lease had been terminated, and he was facing potential criminal charges for conspiracy to commit fraud. I found him one evening at Murphy's Tavern, a dive bar near the port where tourists never ventured. He was drunk, unshaven, and looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Well, well," he slurred as I approached his table, "if it isn't the fucking millionaire. Simon, you know what I can't figure out?" He took a long pull from his beer bottle. "Why didn't you just tell her? All those years. Why keep it secret? Would it have mattered? He laughed bitterly. Are you kidding? If Erica had known you were worth $50 million, she never would have looked at me twice. Exactly. The simplicity of it seemed to hit him like a physical blow. Jesus Christ. You wanted her to cheat. I wanted to know who she really was. And now you do. Now I do. Simon finished his beer and signaled the bartender for another. So what happens now? You ride off into the sunset with your millions and Erica and I get to live in the gutter? What happens now is that you learn there are consequences for your actions. Consequences? He laughed again. You know what's funny? I actually liked you. Before all this started, I thought you were a decent guy. A little boring, maybe, but decent. I am decent, I said. I'm just not stupid. No, Simon agreed. You're definitely not stupid. I left him there with his beer and his self-pity. I had more important things to do. The last hearing was a formality. Judge Hawkins had clearly made up her mind, and Pemberton's attempts to salvage something for Erica were half-hearted at best. In the matter of Locke versus Locke, the judge began, this court finds that the petitioner engaged in adultery and attempted fraud against the respondent. Furthermore, the court finds that the respondent's assets are primarily separate property, acquired through inheritance rather than marital efforts. She looked directly at Erica, who sat ramrod straight in her chair, trying to maintain some dignity in defeat. Mrs. Locke, you are entitled to no spousal support and no division of marital assets. You may keep your personal property and any gifts given to you during the marriage, but that is all. Erica's composure finally cracked. Your Honor, this isn't fair. I gave 8 years of my life to this marriage. And you chose to end it by committing adultery and planning to defraud your husband, Judge Hawkins replied coldly. The court has no sympathy for your situation. The gavel came down with a sound like a gunshot. It was over. Outside the courthouse, Erica confronted me one last time. Her face was streaked with tears, her carefully applied makeup ruined. I hope you're happy, she said. I'm satisfied. 8 years, David. 8 years of my life. 8 years of lying, I corrected. 8 years of pretending to love me, while planning to take everything I had. I did love you. No, I said. You loved the idea of me, the struggling environmentalist who needed your help to navigate the world. You never loved the real me, because you never bothered to find out who that was. She stared at me for a long moment, searching for something to say that might hurt me the way I'd hurt her. Finally, she gave up. You're not the man I married, she said. You're right, I agreed. I'm better. 6 months later, I threw another party at the mansion. This one wasn't for charity, it was a celebration. The restoration work was nearly complete, funded by a small fraction of the trust's annual income. The gardens were immaculate, the paint was fresh, and the old house looked like it had when my grandfather was alive. Felix found me on the back terrace, looking out at the greenhouse where it all began. I'd had it demolished the week after the divorce was finalized. Any regrets? He asked, handing me a glass of champagne. About which part? Any of it. All of it. I considered the question. Erica had left Charleston entirely, moving to Atlanta where no one knew her story. Simon had declared bankruptcy and was rumored to be working construction in Colombia. Most of our mutual friends had chosen sides, and predictably, they'd chosen the side with money. No, I said finally. No regrets. Not even about the deception, keeping the trust secret all those years. Especially not about that. My grandfather was right. It was the only way to know who people really were. And now you know. Now I know. The party continued around us, filled with people who genuinely seemed to enjoy my company. Some were old friends who'd known me before the revelation. Others were new acquaintances drawn by shared interests rather than financial opportunity. I'd learned to tell the difference. Ms. Jean appeared at my elbow with a fresh bottle of champagne and a knowing smile. Your grandfather would be proud, she said quietly. I hope so. He always said the money was a test. Most people fail it one way or another. What about me? You passed, Mr. David. You passed with flying colors. As the evening wound down and the last guests departed, I walked through the mansion's restored rooms, thinking about the future. The trust would continue its environmental work, but now I could be open about my involvement. I was already planning new initiatives, larger projects that could make a real difference. But more than that, I was free. Free from deception. Free from a marriage built on lies. Free from people who saw me as nothing more than a means to an end. I'd learned something important about revenge. It's not about destroying your enemies. It's about revealing the truth and letting them destroy themselves. Erica and Simon had done exactly that, and I hadn't had to break a single law or compromise my principles in the process. Justice, it turned out, was far more satisfying than vengeance. I poured myself one last glass of champagne and raised it in a toast to the empty house. To the truth, I said aloud, however long it takes to surface. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed midnight, and I smiled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new people to meet. People who would know exactly who I was from the beginning. I was David Locke, heir to the Locke Environmental Trust, and I was finally ready to live my life in the open. The skeleton key had unlocked more than just secrets. It had unlocked my future.